Hi everyone, this is Marta Werner, and we are now entering the fourth week of the semester, hard as that is to believe. And I wanted to begin this video by just giving you a few notes on your blogs, and then previewing the next week's reading. So first of all, you wrote about the Custom House, Nathaniel Hawthorne's very interesting introduction to the Scarlet Letter, the Custom House. And here's what some of you touched on. Some of you touched on the genre of the Custom House. And many of you picked up on the fact that this is really a hybrid genre, right? That Hawthorne is writing, on the one hand, autobiography, and on the other hand, he's writing fiction. And quite importantly, there is a kind of blurring of the lines between autobiography and fiction. Some of you also touched on the narrator, right? The narrator as a figure related to, but perhaps not always identical with Nathaniel Hawthorne himself. And this is also important, right? So at what point are we dealing with a fictional narrator, and at what point are we dealing with a narrator who is in fact speaking as Nathaniel Hawthorne? Some of you considered Nathaniel Hawthorne's very complex relationship to Salem. And of course, that's a relationship that encompasses the relationship to Hawthorne's ancestors. And that's complex too, right? Hawthorne has both a great reverence for his ancestors, many of whom were forefathers, right? The early Puritan settlers and forefathers of this country. They were strong of will. They were extremely determined people. But he also recognizes that they were at times extremely intolerant. Right? So there's a complex and quite almost double relationship between Hawthorne and his ancestors. On the one hand, he admires them and he seeks, in some senses, their approval, and on the other hand, he disapproves of them and feels, in some sense, that he has to expiate for their sins, very serious sins in some cases. Some of you also touched on the relationship that Hawthorne has with his readers, a very delicate relationship, a very, in some senses, distant relationship, but also very intimate relationship. I've always been particularly struck by Hawthorne's sense that he is speaking in his work, in his writing, not necessarily to the people who surround him, right, to his, as he puts it, his life mates and his friends, right, but oftentimes to people who would appear to be quite distant to him, but who really understand him. Right? And so sometimes the most intimate reader is also the most distant reader. And that kind of dialectic, right, between intimacy and distance is a very interesting one, not only in the Custom House, but in many of Hawthorne's writings, and one that some of you might want to pursue a little bit further. A few of you hazarded some thoughts about Hawthorne's writing style in the Custom House, and some of you pointed to its consonance with American romance fiction, and some of you pointed to its dissonance with American romance fiction. And I think, and I'm not hedging my bets here, but I think that you were both, whichever position you took, you were both in part right. There is a strain of this, of the Custom House that really is more like realism than what we would call American romanticism. But there is, I think, particularly at the end of the Custom House, a return, right, or a kind of pulling back from realism and a return to American romanticism in Hawthorne's movement out of the Custom House and back into the house of fiction. Right? His escape, his literal escape from the Custom House is also a figurative escape, and a figurative escape that allows him to move back into writing and to fulfill his vocation. Some of you also talked about Hawthorne's path from the Custom House to the House of Fiction, right? Really kind of tracing Hawthorne's transformation over the course of writing that piece. some of you are drawing very productively on the text in your responses. And I want to encourage those of you who aren't doing that yet, or who aren't doing it very much, to really try to do that in your next blogs. It's very, very important, right? When we're thinking about literature, it's not just what literature has to tell us, right? It's not about getting a message, right, or a moral. It's also about the way something is told to us, right? Why literature makes so much of an impression on us, right? An impression that is far more lasting and far more profound, say, than the impression one would get from the words of a Hallmark card, right? Or even something that isn't as well written. So when we look at a work of literature, one of the things we really want to do is to look closely at key passages in that work and to see how, right, how is the writer conveying his or her ideas in meaningful and in ways that are really, that we will remember. And Frank Kermode, who is a great, you might not know his name, but if you study in the field of literature for a long time, you will come to know it. He was one of the very, very great literary critics of the 20th century. And he often referred to what he called radiant moments in a text. And these radiant moments in a text were passages, right, or key scenes in a text that absolutely kind of encapsulated something critical, something essential about what an author was doing, right, saying and doing. And he would focus his analyses around those radiant moments. I'd like you, when you do your next posts, to try Frank Kermode's method. Right? Identify one or two, or possibly even three, although that would really be a lot. One or two would be certainly sufficient. Moments in the text that you find very important for whatever reason, and to give those moments close readings, to read the language, to read the imagery, and to let those close readings pull you out, right, draw you out into larger considerations of theme and meaning. As you move into the body of the Scarlet Letter, I'd like to also have you direct your thoughts to a question that most of you didn't address when you talked about the Custom House, but that is also there, at least in a kind of beginning, nascent way. And that is about the relationship between fiction and history. Right? Just as some of you did point out that there is a kind of hybridity to the genre of the Custom House, right? Part autobiography, part fiction. So the Scarlet Letter is a kind of hybrid text in that it certainly draws intensely on history, but it is, of course, also fiction. And I'd like you perhaps to answer, at least for yourselves, and possibly in the course of a meditation in a blog, a question. And that question is, why is history so important to Hawthorne? What does he get from history? Why is history so often his source? And a second question, if history is so important to Hawthorne, which it clearly is, why doesn't he become a historian? Right? Why does he choose to be a writer of fiction, and particularly a particular kind of fiction, right, romance fiction, as opposed to being a historian? And some of you may, in fact, be studying history in this class, but think about what is involved in each discipline. What do we get from the study of history? What do we get from the study of literature? How do those two studies complement each other? But also, what is different about them? Right? What kind of access, and here I'd like the focus to be on literature, right? What kind of access does literature give us that perhaps history does not? Okay, so I think that would be a very good point of departure. This week, if you look at our Moodle block for this week, the focus is almost entirely on reading, right? Reading the Scarlet Letter, or at least beginning your reading of the Scarlet Letter, and then looking at some passages that I've excerpted from that text, which you might consider as radiant passages, or passages that are at least very productive of analysis. And certainly, you're free to just do precisely that, right? Read as much of the work as you can, and also look at those selected passages. But you may also want to skip ahead a little bit to the next block. And if it helps you to listen to a lecture either before or immediately after your reading, you may want to begin to listen to the lecture materials on the Scarlet Letter. Or you may want to look at some of the discussion questions. Or you may want to look at the document called Some Possible Pathways Through the Scarlet Letter. Whatever works best for you is just fine. But this is primarily a reading week and not a blogging week, so there's no blog that is due. But I did add an open forum for questions. This is a very optional forum. You need not send anything to it unless you want to. But if you do have questions as you move along in your reading, and it would be helpful to have them answered sooner rather than later, please feel free to send your question to that blog, and of course I will try to answer them as quickly as possible. I hope that you enjoy The Scarlet Letter. It's an early novel by Hawthorne. It was certainly the novel that levered him into a kind of literary fame. And I think it's a jewel of a novel. Very, very beautifully constructed, very tightly constructed. It's also, to my mind, very different from the novels that Hawthorne wrote later. I love those novels too, but this is a very different kind of work. And be aware of the structure of this work. It's very almost theatrical, in the sense that the scaffold that you see in the opening scenes returns at critical points during the narrative and really helps to structure the novel. In any case, enjoy the reading. I look forward to your questions if you have them, and I certainly look forward to next week and your meditations on Hawthorne. Take care, and I'll see you soon.